our laundry, mothers always prepared laundry by cooking a huge vat on top of a double stove.
My mother never did that.
We had a huge vat, you know, it was about 4 or 5 feet wide, full of hot water and soap. And your mother would boil the linens and stuff like that. And then after we would wash it and rinse it, they would hang it out on a line to dry. Now the line was a cord on 2 pulleys, a continuous cord on 2 pulleys, and it extended between 2 buildings. So that you would screw a hook into your building and a screw hook into your neighbor's building, and then put this line across there with the 2 pulleys, one on either side. So that all you had to do was start at the knot, put your laundry on here, and you put clothespins on it, and roll it out, and then you put more clothespins on it, and roll it out, until you had a whole line extended between your building and the next building.
Yeah,
and this was a wonderful thing.
Tell me how you look out on her line and you saw 21 shirts.
She had shirts. My mother had a load of shirts. She had 3 boys and my father. She had a load of shirts, which we subsequently learned how to iron. All the boys learned how to iron. We learned how to sew. It was interesting. Of course, the drying part was funny in the winter, because if you put wet stuff outside to dry,
it used to freeze.
It would freeze. And so you would pull it in and you would find your bed sheet was a frozen bed sheet. It looked like a pancake.
No, my mother didn't have to do that. We had a laundry wagon, a horse and wagon, come along, and they used to come up. Mama had a great big bundle, and she used to ask for wet and flat. So when it used to come back, some of the things like sheets were already finished and ironed and beautiful. And the other thing that was wet, it wasn't wet. It was like when you take it out of a washing machine. But now, here we take it out of a washing machine and put it in a dryer. But then they used to hang it up on the line. And then when they took it down, sometimes they sprinkled certain things. They had to do all the ironing. It was a hard life.
Now, when my mother was living in Lower Manhattan, we had a boarder. We had somebody living with us. It was a way of getting rent. You know, you'd get $2, $3 a week, and somebody would share a bedroom or something if you had an extra bedroom.
You know, immigrants would come and they would rent a room
on the Lower East Side. They had a lot of people had boarders. They used to do their laundry, prepare their meals, and they would charge them a flat fee. But that was a very common practice in those days. And people did that to eke out a living. Sometimes they would rent a pushcart on the Lower East Side. And I know my father had one once. And,
tell them about the different push carts that used to come through the street with different goodies, like the chestnuts.
Oh, yeah. They had itinerant peddlers who would buy chestnuts by the pound. And if you know anything about cooking a chestnut, they take the chestnut and they cut a cross, starting one longitudinal cut and a horizontal cut, forming a cross, like a plus sign. And then they would put it into pails with charcoal at the bottom, and they would bake the chestnuts, and they would sell them by the bagful. Many, many years later, they also had other itinerant people who used to have something that looked like a... At that age, I was 3 years old when the war started. And so I don't remember any of that. The only thing I remember about the war is we used to have, I think they had saving stamps if I remember, or maybe that was World War II. They had saving stamps where the kids would, for a nickel, buy a stamp and put it in a little booklet, just like these S&H stamps. They did the same thing with it. When you had a book full of stamps, they would turn it over for a little bond. So the kids were engaged in the war. I think there were food collections. Very often there would be families would contribute canned goods or other food, stuff like that. The public was really behind World War I rather well. The only thing I remembered vividly was the story when the war was over and the soldiers paraded down Fifth Avenue. It was very impressive. And then we had soldiers on horseback coming to the side streets of Harlem. And on our street, we had a street full of men sitting on horses where the wives and the women in the buildings, the various buildings, came down with homemade bakings, cakes and pies and whatever they had. Fruit, they would bring fruit and nuts, and they would all give them to the soldiers. They were very, very grateful that the war was over and that was victory. And I don't remember very much more about that World War I, because even when the war was over, I was only 7 years old. So I don't remember that very well. But I do remember later on, when we started to go to school, we had a very interesting thing. The neighborhood was very, very Jewish, and we enjoyed the Jewish holidays. Every Jewish holiday was respected. The most insignificant holiday was respected. So whenever you checked the attendance in the school, you would find that on any Jewish holiday, no matter how trivial, how inconsequential, the whole Jewish population stayed home. In the neighborhood, you could tell a Jewish neighborhood because if it was a Jewish holiday, the butcher would close, the grocer would close, everybody would close down. Many, many of the kids went to shul, you know, to the temple or synagogue. They went to the synagogue, and some of them even knew how to read the prayer books. But most of us were rather young. In my group, we were all rather young. And I know I went to a shula, a small Hebrew school, after school. I mean, in other words, I went about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. First of all, I'd go home from school at 3. I'd have a sandwich or something, some milk. And then I would go to Cheder, or the Hebrew school. And there the rabbi would have a handful of boys there. It could have been anywhere from 6 to 16 boys in one room. And we would all read from the book. Of course, the rabbi, being an elderly man who was trained in Europe, didn't occur to him that it would be a good idea if we knew what we were reading. But his purpose was not to teach us what was reading, in other words, to understand what we were saying. His purpose was to teach us what to say. And so we learned how to read Hebrew. We learned the alphabet, and we learned the words. But I don't know if any of the kids knew what the words meant. And years later, when I went before my bar mitzvah, I went to the institutional synagogue on 116th Street between 5th and Lenox Avenue. That was a new building, very up to date. They had a swimming pool and a little gymnasium. Very unusual for a Jewish school, but we had it. In that school, we not only studied Hebrew, but we studied the meaning of Hebrew. And so we began to learn words like, I still remember Hayalda and Hayeled. And if I remember, Hayeled was the boy and Hayalda was the girl. That's about all I remember. No, voracious at the beginning. When we studied the Bible, I think the first word was voracious.
Tell me about the Depression and how it. Were you first aware of the Depression? I'm asking both of you.
I think you have to give the lead-up time. In 1928, when I was a senior in high school, in the Echo class, we all used to talk about going down to some broker, borrowing money, buying stock on margin. The stock would go up, we'd sell it, we'd make a profit, we'd pay the broker, then we'd borrow some more money plus our profit, so we would buy more stock, the stock would go up, we would sell it, make the money, pay the margin, and then we would keep on doing it until everybody became rich. It never occurred to anybody that the stock might go down. Everybody in the class, in the Echo class, all of us knew that stocks only go up. Well, around 1929, things happened. We don't know why it happened or anything, but we know it happened. When all of a sudden the headlines in the newspapers, Wall Street crash, the stocks tumbled bitterly. Now, most people bought on a margin. They owed money to a broker. And the broker wasn't going to wait As soon as your stock fell below his margin, he'd call you up on the phone and say, you must cover your margin. You must give me more money. And
Many
if
people
you-
didn't have telephones at those days.
Well,
They
for
used
the
to send
people
them a
who bought,
telegram.
then they would send a telegram, you know. They'd either call you or send a telegram. But for people who are buying stock, many of them did have phones. We didn't, but many of them did. And he'd call for margin. If you didn't have the money to pay, you might go to the bank and borrow some money using your stock to protect the bank. But it didn't protect them very long, because you could have a margin call at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock there would be another margin call. The stock dropped further. And after a while, people lost their shirts. Every cent they owned in the world was lost. They'd mortgaged their house, and that money was lost. And so there was a rash of suicides, where men would be jumping out of the high, tall buildings in Wall Street area. They would jump out of the tall buildings, figuring that after they died, their family would have an insurance policy, and there would be a little money in the house.
1 minute.
Then 142nd Street, I was about 12 years old at the time of the crash, and my father came home one night, and he said, I'm all wiped out. And I looked at him. I looked the same, he looked the same, Mama looked the same. I didn't feel any poorer than I did the day before. I just couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. He owned some stock of Graham Page. That was an automobile, a fancy automobile. He owned stock, and also on margin like everybody else, and he was all wiped out. And the thing that puzzled me is we lived in a small apartment, and we were poor people, and I just couldn't comprehend the whole thing. You mean we owned an automobile? Where? You mean we were rich yesterday and we're not today? The whole thing it was very difficult for me to fathom, but I remember the day when my father came home and said we're all wiped out. I said I was going to talk about our trip to the country.
No, we'll do that later.
To another subject.
No, we're still in the Depression.
Oh, we're talking about the Depression? Well,
We'll get back to
it
the
got
country.
worse and worse, but somehow I ate the same, and I lived the same. We moved to the Westchester Avenue section, 1250 Morrison Avenue. We moved into a new building. We had a 3-room apartment, a small kitchen, a medium-sized living room, and a nice bedroom. Had 3 windows in it, I recall. Now, my mother and father slept on a sleep sofa in the